Welcome to the LaunchFamily Podcast, where we make sense of modern parenting one real conversation at a time. I'm your host, Jessica Shelley, mom of 6, a former teacher, and your trusted friend helping you cut through the noise of today's parenting overload. If you've ever found yourself wondering how to set healthy boundaries in your home or navigate family conflict without losing your mind, you're not alone. Today's episode is all about building stronger relationships by honoring everyone's voice, especially our children's, even during the most stressful times. I'm thrilled to introduce our guests, Jan and Jillian Yuhas. Is that how you say your last name?
Correct.
Perfect. Awesome. Twin sisters, relationship coaches, certified mediators, and co-authors of Boundary Badass. They specialize in helping families set healthy boundaries in both traditional and co-parenting households. Whether you're navigating everyday tension or more complex coercive control dynamics, Jan and Jillian offer practical insights rooted in emotional intelligence, assertive communication, and shared agreements. Jan and Jillian, welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks for having us.
Oh my goodness, I love this. I can't wait to dive into the conversation. So can you guys start by giving us a little bit of background and what led you both to this world of family coaching and mediation?
Yes, many moons ago, like 25 years ago almost now, we volunteered at a crisis hotline with children or teenagers that were running away from home. And we did that for about 3 years. And we would have to mediate agreements between the teens and the parents over the phone because it was like a hotline service. And then figure out where the disconnect was in the family dynamics and why the child kept running away from home. And so we would have to work through that, and that kind of inspired us that we wanted to work with more families. We ended up getting our master's in marriage and family therapy. And then after that, we got certified in coaching and mediation.
Incredible. So really kind of like that grassroots sort of experience that kind of changed the trajectory, shaped the trajectory of your entire career.
Yes.
How is it working as sisters now? And how is that approach? You guys are twins. So how does that kind of collaboration and things come through in the work that you're doing today?
Well, I think being identical twins, we sort of always had this we mindset where we've had to consider how it may impact the other person. And so I think professionally that's very much helped us, which is sort of how we came for our method. But I think too, we do have our sisterly moments like most siblings do, but you just need to know when to call a timeout and say, hey, like, let's get back to business, our operations, and proceed forward. So I think what's great is like we always have the same goals and visions as business owners, but sometimes how we get there, we have different perspectives. So just working through those differences and implementing our method is something, that we thrive on. So.
Yeah. And what are some, like in the work that you do, what are some of those like common sources of conflict that you see and help families navigate most commonly, I guess?
Yeah, when it comes to like more the co-parenting dynamics or households, we see a lot of tension usually between the co-parents if there's an imbalance in the dynamic and one person is constantly fighting for control over the other parent, or one is a great communicator, the other one is completely avoidant and doesn't respond and stonewalls to communication. Sometimes high conflict personality types will weaponize the children against the other parent in those sort of dynamics, and then or use the child for their own like emotional sounding board, and they become that pseudo spouse or reverse role, parent-child role, which is parentification. So that's kind of what we see in the co-parenting dynamics.
Can you walk us through? Oh, sorry, go ahead.
In regular family households that are still intact, then in terms of those sort of dynamics, we work mostly with parents, but then also, or couples, and those sort of things. They might have different parenting styles that are showing up, and one parent doesn't like how they're parenting versus the other parent. Sometimes there's favoritism that's playing out between the children that's not always obvious to the parental dynamic, but sometimes if one child has preferred privileges that maybe the other child doesn't, and sometimes it can be very subtle and not so obvious, but then that creates dynamics between the siblings that causes a rift as well. And so it just kind of trickles down from there.
That makes a lot of sense too. And I love those kind of examples that you pulled in about even like the sibling dynamic, right? For listeners that are, listening into this conversation today, what are some of those things or behaviors that they might be experiencing at home? Could you maybe share like some phrases or conversations or actions? Like what would these kinds of things be? How would this look in their homes right now?
I think often people will hear that they're being blamed for a certain behavior or they're being blamed. And so a lot of times people are lacking that accountability, whether it's a parent or a child, but there's just a lack of accountability in terms of our behaviors and understanding how our behaviors may impact other people. I think sometimes too, people might say you're too emotional, you're too sensitive, so they're gaslighting. They're calling people out for how they may respond to a certain situation. And so they think that everyone should sort of align to the way that they see the perspective or their approach to the situation. And so they're not open-minded or don't have open perspective in regards to how other people might react or respond to a certain trigger that could be showing up. I think a lot of times too, people might go silent when they're feeling in a trauma, situation or feeling overwhelmed. They tend to shut down, and so sometimes people will hide too. So paying attention to behaviors in terms of silence is also another sign.
Yeah, and so I'm thinking too, like I have 6 children, right? And so me and my husband, we parent our kids very different. And we both grew up in very different homes. And so how does our own experience of how we were raised maybe influence the way that we approach our children and the dynamic between the kids?
So I think a lot of times generational patterns will show up in terms of parenting dynamics. And so sometimes it's a matter of just understanding, because obviously we learn through role model behavior within the home. And so then also understanding how, when you're speaking with your husband, like how do you guys see this parenting issue differently, but then how can you find a shared value and a common ground that allows you to sort of have synergy for the children? Because if the children are experiencing 2 different types of parenting styles, it can be confusing, and then they don't know where their clear boundaries are or limits are. So then if mom says, you can't have chocolate until after you eat dinner, but dad says, oh, it's not going to hurt you, have a piece of chocolate, but then you need to eat your dinner. Well, that's confusing for the child. So sometimes working through the differences can really just be helpful in finding, like I said, the shared goal or value, but then making sure like the children also understand what their limits are or boundaries within the home.
I love that, like that perspective of shared value or like the shared goal, right? Because it is those kind of simple conversations when it's like, can you have a piece of chocolate before dinner, or do you need to wait till after you eat your dinner? And it's like, we as parents in the thick of it, like we don't necessarily think about it. If our kid is just coming up to us asking if they can have a treat, sometimes we just brush it off like, oh yeah, sure, yeah. Or, oh no, you need to wait till after dinner. And then that's when we, at least for me, and I'm sure some of our listeners too, they go to the other parent to try to like
Correct.
play it off, right? And so then you get into those conversations of like, oh, well, mom said I could. And it's like, okay, well, yeah, I did, but where's the issue coming now? It's like, oh, dad said I couldn't, right?
Yeah, children sometimes will pin the other parent against the other parent in order to get what they want. And it's not that they're being manipulative. It's just that they're testing their boundaries and trying to figure out how they can get their need met.
Yeah, which I think is like exactly why I love that vision of like, oh, we have a common goal, we have a shared value. Like this is something that just becomes routine so that the kids know those boundaries. In sibling kind of relationships and things, you talked a little bit and touched a little bit on like sibling rivalry, like additional like parent time or additional privileges, things like that. How does that maybe stem from those parental interactions, or what are some things that parents should be mindful of when they're looking at their children and that sibling relationship?
So yeah, I think a lot of that, sometimes it plays out indirectly. Let's say like, one parent's favoring a child that's the same gender as them versus the other child in the dynamic. If that one gender has more privileges or they get to have a later curfew versus the other child. Or one child is allowed to choose what they get to have for dinner like several nights a week and the other children are not. So it's just very subtle things that can be very like meaningless on the surface, but what it's happening is creating a dynamic between the siblings that they feel one child might feel less than, that doesn't have the special like privileges they feel the other child is getting, and it starts to weigh on their self-worth, or they start to act out and have maladaptive coping skills or behaviors in order to say like, hey, look at me, I'm here, I'm going to act out. I'm not getting positive attention or response from my parents, so I'm going to do the complete opposite to find where I fit in the family, to be heard and understood.
I also think too, a lot of times parents will be like, oh, your brother did this or your sister did this. And so they'll take achievements of one child and basically try to get the other child motivated to do something. But then when you're doing like sort of the tit for tat, or you're positioning one child's excellence towards another child who may be, who has, may not excel in academics, but they excel in sports, or they excel in arts and music. It's like, you need to see each child individually and independently for who they are, as every child's going to be different, especially when they're also born into the family dynamic as well, and how their parents are showing up during that period of time. So there's lots of layers there.
Yeah, I mean, my wheels are already spinning for like, I'm thinking about my own children right now. So I'm sure that our listeners listening in are also considering like, well, what does this look like for me? Any strategies for how parents can make it feel, I guess, more fair in the eyes of the child, or systems or things that have helped other families kind of navigate those struggles?
Well, I think it's really important for families to develop their value system to operate by, because that becomes kind of your roadmap in terms of your decision making. So if the family operates, from pick 3 to 5 top values, whether it's like honesty, communication, integrity, time management, what else in families that are really important? Transparency. So if you're operating from your values, then you're in alignment with your truth, and then you're showing up with integrity across the board with all of your children. You also might have some family-like guidelines that everybody has to follow, that, maybe they have certain chores they have to do for a week. They have certain bedtimes they have to follow. So there's different things that the family can be implementing across the board that just becomes a standard routine or a way of functioning. And obviously there's flexibility within that as well.
Yeah, so even involving the kids in this conversation, I'm like, these are all of our agreements as a family.
Absolutely. When it comes to boundary setting with children, especially teenagers, but even younger children, you can ask them, okay, if you don't do your homework, or if you're going to stay up in your room and past till 10 p.m., what do you think your consequence should be for that behavior? And then you create an agreement with the child, and then that child is accountable for their own behavior, and they're having to develop integrity and accountability.
Yeah, because then the child can't necessarily get mad at you. So this really eliminates power struggles between parents and children, because you're actually having an open conversation, and the child learns to really actually find their inner voice and have their own independence, which also is going to help them excel developmentally. So that way they learn that, like, when it comes to authority or, parents, that they also realize that they can have a voice in it, even though they need to respect the other person, but they need to respect themselves too. And giving them that ability to talk is so helpful in that moment.
Yeah, and you mentioned boundaries too. So what is, I guess, like, let's just define what a boundary is, and then maybe like what is a healthy boundary, right? Let's do that first.
So healthy boundaries is going to look different for every household or home. So this is where you want to identify what feels good to you in terms of the family home. Is like having open communication really important for all family members. And so if you guys value open communication, then if your child comes to you with feeling like stressed, hurt or sad or even happy, like, you want to be available to listen to whatever they are going to share. Because if you say, I don't have time to listen to you right now, or I'm really busy, that's shutting down the child's voice. And then they think, well, why do I have to value communication if nobody's going to listen to me?
And you don't have to be at your child's beck and call. If you are busy, you can say, I understand what you have to say. Sounds like it's really important. Let me finish doing X, Y, Z, and let's talk about this in like 10 minutes or whatever it is. So you are, and that's role modeling boundaries as well, that they also have to respect your time and can't expect you to be at their beck and call either. But we're still making sure that we're making time for them to hear them out.
And so I think too, in terms of boundaries, they really identify we want to identify our values, but they're based on the emotional needs of what it is that we need to thrive within the home. And that also brings connection and collaboration. I think there's a lot of misconception in terms of boundaries out there. A lot of people view boundaries as ultimatums where they're like demanding somebody to do something, or like
basically, yeah, if you don't do X, then I'm going to do Y, which is a threat. It's a demand. It's a one-sided perspective being projected onto the relationship. And more than likely, if you are making these unrealistic demands that don't really sit well with the other person or even like the child, they're more likely not going to want to collaborate with you or listen to you. And so we want to make sure our boundaries come from a we mindset. How do we bridge the gap between two opposing perspectives and find common ground that both individuals can live with?
So example two, if like, let's say you have electronics in the home. And so let's say every day the child gets 30 minutes to be on electronics, or they get to watch their favorite TV show, whatever that may look like. And so every day they get their 30 minutes, whenever that is, whether it's after school, before bed, but you're establishing like 30 minutes of electronics within the home. And so that's also setting a boundary for the family to function and everyone to get along as well. But you can also say, if the child's like, oh, can I just have 10 more minutes? Can I just have 10, then that's when they're starting to not honor the boundary. Then you can ask them, we had this discussion that we're only going to get 30 minutes. Can you share how come you're not respecting the boundary that we established, in terms of electronic usage? And so you're teaching everybody, like I said, to have a voice, where ultimatums are very, one person has a voice, where within a family dynamic, everybody has a voice.
And you might even need to negotiate with them as well. It's not that boundaries are rigid, they can be flexible. You could even negotiate extra electronic time on the weekends or something like that, where it's not infringing on their schoolwork or bedtime routine. So it's always open for discussion and negotiation as well.
I love that communication element. Like, it is a family thing. It's a communication. It's a conversation that's happening to establish the boundaries too, to your point of like, it's not an ultimatum, like if this, then that. It's, that kind of collaborative effort, so to speak.
Yes.
So, in a co-parenting or divorce context, what are some of the unique challenges, and how do you help, those kinds of families navigate those challenges?
Yeah, so when it comes to co-parenting dynamics, it's a little bit different. You want to operate more like a business relationship. So we're creating kind of a little bit of a separation, because if you don't do that, it can be very challenging. You're constantly they keep emotionally triggering each other. So we want to potentially communication get off a text message. It's either become strictly on email or on a co-parenting app in order to create that separation. Also, there might be that there's a boundary that children's belongings are their belongings. They don't belong to either parent. They belong to the children. They go back and forth between each household when the children are going from one home to the other. What else in terms of co-parenting boundaries?
I think also too, being able to respect the child's schedule. So sometimes children have a tough time navigating going back between two homes. So really having empathy for the child, but also not, getting mad at your co-parent because the child is coming over to the other house and all of a sudden they need to sleep more. They need extra like hugs or cuddles, whatever it may be. So a lot of times they always immediately want to blame the other parent, but at the same time, you don't want to necessarily blame the child or the parent. You're trying just to try to understand what's going on. So I think also being mindful that you're not necessarily blaming your co-parent, but you're also mindful of like, okay, let's talk, how can we work on this together and maintain a certain bedtime routine or certain breakfast routine that's going to help the child have structure between the two homes.
The mindset of like, what's best for the child, right? And that dynamic of like,
yeah, everything is very child-centered, because we want to stay out that me versus you power struggle that tends to happen more with divorced families. Because usually when you're living in the same family home, you do try to want to be a supportive of a partner, so you have more likely to have that we mindset. But when you're divorced, that kind of goes out the window for those that have more unhealthy personality traits or dynamics that are playing out when it comes to like for coercive control sort of dynamics. So I think a lot of boundaries also have to be set at shared events, the child's activities, school events, parent-teacher conferences. Anytime that they're going to be interacting face-to-face, then we need to also have very clear boundaries. Because a lot of times if there's other younger siblings watching an older sibling play like soccer or football or something like that, then sometimes a parent will act like that child, the younger siblings, it's my parenting time. They can only sit with me, like they're like my property, when really the child should be allowed to sit with whoever, the either parent at the event, because it's about what makes them happy and feel at peace.
But yeah, if the parents can't get along, we always recommend that the other parent gets 10 minutes before the event or after the event with the other child, especially if they want to take photographs or something. So sometimes you really have to set much more hard line boundaries in types of situations, especially if the conflict is very heightened in terms of how they interact.
Mm-hmm.
Well, tell us more about your book, Boundary Badass. What inspired it and who is it for?
So Boundary Badass was inspired, it's kind of like our own personal journey in life. So we grew up in a rural farm town of 900, moved to a metropolitan city of 3 million, and she and I realized that we needed stronger boundaries because where we grew up, we were used to being heard and understood, or our parents had integrity in terms of like meeting our needs, even though our parents were divorced growing up. We still had our needs met. But then we moved to a metropolitan city and it was a huge culture shock for us. And we did not know how to be heard and understood because we were used to voicing what it is our needs were and being respected. Well, now we're engaging with lots of other, individuals with lots of other different upbringings, and that kind of threw us in a whole nother dynamic. And so we needed to have stronger boundaries for ourselves. And we realized in that journey that operating from your values, you're more likely to be heard and understood rather than operating from emotion. So that's kind of how we developed our formula, was actually operating our first business, which was a family-oriented business as well. And that's kind of, it grew from there. And then we decided to write a book. And we cover all different types of boundaries throughout the book. There's professional boundaries, family boundaries, holiday boundaries with extended family, neighbors, work colleagues, entrepreneurs, children boundaries, emotional, personal time, you name it.
But I think the book is really for anybody that wants to strengthen their boundaries and wants to understand how they can elevate their own value, but then also strengthen their relationships. So it's really about like owning your voice, especially if you feel fearful of conflict, or if you're fearful to speak up, or feel like if you're always doing for other people and then you feel like you're not being respected. So it also teaches you too, in a way, how to heal some of those childhood wounds that could be showing up in your adult relationships or with your children. So that way you can sort of nip some of those generational patterns that are no longer serving a purpose and be able to cut the cord and sort of eliminate some of that enmeshment where you're now owning, this is my life, this is my family, these are what we need to do. And so just knowing to know what's important to you, because if you don't know your value system, it's going to be very hard to show up confident and secure with yourself and know that what's important to you. It may be hard. People may not understand it if it's not a clear boundary to begin with.
So it sounds like some of the work as a parent should maybe start with ourselves and our own reflection of where am I at? What do I value? What is my co-parent or my spouse or partner? Also, they need to do some reflection, and then we come together with everyone and be like, okay, we're all on the same page, and then collaboratively create those boundaries. I guess tell me more about that. What do we say? How do we kind of navigate that discussion?
Yeah, so you might have personal boundaries that are important to you as a person. You might have a different set for professional boundaries as well in terms of work, but you also might have different values, with your spouse, in terms of what's the most important. So I would always try to find at least 3 out of 5 in terms of with your spouse, in terms of your relationship that you value, because the more, if you have 3 out of 5 that are in alignment, that relationship's more likely to have longevity because you're on the same page, because those values are meeting your emotional needs on a deeper level and creating respect within the dynamic.
And you had mentioned, I think too, on our initial call, this idea of boundary scripts. Can you explain what those are and how they can help parents or if they want to navigate through this?
Of course. So we have a couple different programs in regards to boundary scripts. At our divorce company, we have them for co-parenting, and then we also have them as well, scripts that our parents can use with their children navigating the dynamics of like divorce. Because sometimes, like I said, the children are weaponized or manipulated. So it kind of goes through that. And then on our, for those families that are more intact, that are struggling with like partners or parents or even friends, work colleagues, it kind of goes through all different types of manipulation tactics like gaslighting, triangulation, stonewalling,
Emotional dependency, triangulation.
Yeah, so it goes through all different types of manipulation tactics, and then it has a bunch of different scripts in terms of how you would address that behavior that you're experiencing. So we're not really ever addressing the person, we're addressing the behavior that we find unacceptable or disrespectful in order to figure out how we can create a mutual agreement that everyone's on the same page.
Yeah, so for example, if I value communication in a personal relationship, I would say I feel ignored when there's lack of communication or there's a lack of response in text messages. I value communication. How can we work on, corresponding with each other? So I want to end in a question that leads to a bigger goal, but also opens up the conversation. So I'm only addressing, like she said, the behavior. I'm identifying my value, but then I'm also trying to ask an open-ended question that's going to invite curiosity, connection, collaboration, but is headed towards a goal. And then in a professional relationship or co-parenting, you might detach yourself and you would say it seems or appears we're not on the same page when it comes to activities. I value collaboration. How can we establish who's choosing which activities for spring and fall season so we make sure the children are signed up appropriately?
And I want to come back to this point that you guys made earlier too, where like the child is at the center, right? Which can also, I think, maybe in that mentality, in those heated zones, be like, okay, I need to step back and like, what is our focus, right? If you are in like the co-parenting or divorce dynamic, what does it look like when you actually, making sure that the child's voice is heard in those dynamics? If there is things happening between the parents, how do you focus on the child and maybe take a step back?
So I think especially on transition days are the hardest for the child. You can always do it like let's check in with each other. How are you feeling right now? What's been going on? Is there anything you'd like to talk about? Anything you want to share? But you want to get at their level. So especially if they're younger, you want to like kneel down or sit together on the couch, whatever it may be, and just try to have an open conversation. So we usually call them discovery questions, which are open-ended questions that allow for bigger answers than yes or no. Because if you ask a closed-ended question, such as, are you feeling sad right now? Well, then you're actually saying that the child is sad, which doesn't allow them to actually speak for themselves. So you always just want to ask, how are you feeling? Or
you don't kind of seem like yourself today. Is everything okay? Or is there something we need to talk about? So you're kind of just making an observation that maybe they're more withdrawn or not acting at their normal baseline behavior.
Yeah. But I would say you always want to do check-ins with your children. And if things are fine, then you just let them be. You don't want to push them, because sometimes too in that moment they may not want to talk, but then maybe an hour later they come back around and say, Mom or Dad, I've been feeling this, or my stomach hurts. Well, let's talk about what does the stomach ache stem from, because often a lot of times stomach aches are emotion that's not being expressed. And so, especially for children, when they have those body aches, the headaches, the leg aches, like usually there's sometimes...
Yeah, bathroom habits are always usually a sign. A child is one of the first cues if they feel like they don't have control over their environment, is their bodily functions are going to tell you, because sometimes children will use their bowel movements as a way to control what's happening around them. So that's just something that typically shows up with especially younger children.
So what do you have, what tips do you have for families that are trying to repair after a conflict, or maybe there's already been, some instance of hurt or something? How do they kind of navigate that conversation with their children or with their spouse or partner or co-parent through those dynamics?
Well, I think each person has to take responsibility for their role or action in that argument. So you would say I want to apologize for my behavior, X, whatever that may be. And I would like to, I plan to work on X. where do you see that you contributed to this dynamic, or what do you think could have caused us, or how do you see us working better together in the future? And trying to get the other person also to take responsibility, accountability for their behavior, how they contribute. Now, if you have somebody who's not willing to honor their accountability for their behaviors, then you're going to need to dive deeper into, okay, how come you're not willing to take responsibility for this, argument, and more or less, how's it going to impact our relationship if we don't each of us find a way to take responsibility? Because if one person, it's going to develop resentment, it's going to develop, anger, frustration. If one person feels like they always have to be the mender, the fixer, the problem solver, and the other person, especially with adults, whether it's a parent or a spouse or co-parent, like if they always feel like they have to take the responsibility, then it's going to feel like a power imbalance, which can be really hard. But I think also too, you want to teach children, if there's even a parent-child argument, and say the parent also and the child each need to take responsibility for their actions. Because if the parent also never says, if they are in this like authority figure and they never apologize for their behavior, then the child doesn't learn. They don't learn to apologize if they do something that's inappropriate or hurtful to the other person.
That makes a lot of sense. I mean, I'm a former teacher, and I think one of the things that we talk about is like an instructional strategy is modeling behavior. And so I think to your point there of like parents should model that behavior of apologizing, right? Like that's how they would learn, and that's how they'd be exposed to those kind of conversations and techniques for navigating life, where hopefully, later on down the line, they don't have conflicts or as many conflicts or severe conflicts with their spouse or partner or whoever they're interacting with really in their life. So at the end of each of our episodes for the LaunchFamily Podcast, we have questions that have actually been written in from parents directly. And so I want to take a quick minute to get your take on a couple of these. The first one is, how do I keep boundaries firm without sounding harsh or cold to my child?
So that question comes to me as if a parent believes they're setting more or less an ultimatum, like I'm in charge and you're going to do as I say, which does not usually go over well with children because the child doesn't feel respected. So this is where you want to work on having negotiations with your child in terms of setting boundaries and negotiating what consequences they think should be appropriate for their behavior. And again, the parent also has to agree. And that way the child is accountable for their own breaking of the boundary or the household rules within that dynamic.
I think too, monitoring your tone of voice. How would you like to be spoken to? And how would you receive the information if you came across cold? Or let's say your spouse or someone came across cold to you, how would that make you feel? So you always want to think about, if you were in the other person's shoes, how would that make them feel? But at the same time, does this person also feel guilty for setting a boundary with their child as well? And so that's why they're trying to use coldness as a way to establish like their role within the home, because if they come across very empathetic, they don't feel like they can uphold that boundary themselves either. So I also think if parents are also if you're using coldness, the child's going to think that the parent is shutting them out to a certain extent, or they're being so cold and aggressive in a way that it's very authoritarian. The child's eventually going to learn to withhold how they feel or about certain things because they feel like potentially dismissed or shut out or rejected in that dynamic.
I mean, that makes a lot of sense too. I mean, we, on another one of the podcast episodes that we had a family therapist on, and we were talking about, okay, the boundaries, you have to have shoes, or like one of the rules or expectations of the household is that we wear shoes when we leave the house. Okay. So we're going to help equip you with tools in order to do that. So you can choose the pink shoes or you can choose the yellow shoes today. Like either one is totally fine. They have some say in it. It's a collaborative effort, and we're on our way out the door versus having an argument about not wearing shoes or wearing shoes.
Right. And that's we always recommend that too, especially when you're dealing with challenging personalities, you want to talk to them almost like a toddler in a way that you're giving them two options, whether it's, eggs for breakfast or pancakes. Both options work for you, but they're allowing them to choose because it makes it feel like they're in control. Because when you're dealing with those who are not emotionally developed or they're underdeveloped adults, then letting them position things to feel like they're choosing allows them to honor their voice in that moment.
It sounds like a great strategy for like all aspects, right? Like then I protect myself in this discussion and conversation. I'm happy with either outcome, but at the same time, they feel like they're bought into this as well. So the last question that we have is, I'm stuck in a cycle of arguing with my co-parent. We're constantly undermining each other. So any ideas or strategies for how they can begin to repair trust or navigate this, or at least kind of stabilize the conflict?
I think the biggest thing is don't react to their arguments that they continuously keep presenting. Otherwise, it's becoming a circular conversation. So you want to redirect the conversation by responding and saying, I'm only going to be able to respond to things that are relevant to the children. Otherwise, this conversation has come to an end. Or you might say, like, I disagree with that perspective, but how about we look at it this way through what's going to benefit our child? So you always want to try to redirect them in regards to focusing back to the child, but don't react because they're trying to get underneath your skin. They're trying to get a reaction to flip the script and the narrative so that way you have to take responsibility for the lack of accountability that they're not doing. So if you react, they're winning in that situation. But if you just respond and stay outside of it, you're going to feel much more inner peace and happiness in your own life, because then if you don't add fuel to the fire can't keep burning. So
we want to get out of the me versus you power struggle, and it's more about how are we as parents solving this problem for our children.
Oh my goodness. Well, thank you so much for the insights today. Any final thoughts for parents, listeners that are tuning in today?
I think just being self-aware is probably one of the biggest things we all need to do in life, because often sometimes our own beliefs or thoughts can definitely get projected onto relationship dynamics, and we're not aware of that, which can also hinder connection and collaboration. So just being mindful of how you communicate, what you may say, how the other person may respond. Just be observant and talk more from the heart, not from your head.
Yeah, and I think the most important things we can teach children these days is emotional intelligence, emotional regulation, and critical thinking skills.
I love it all. I'm like, I got my pockets are full from this conversation today. I'm excited to jump in with my own kiddos and my own family, and I'm sure our listeners are just as excited to start taking action and improving some of these household systems and relationships. So Jane and Jillian, I want to thank you both so much for sharing your passion and wisdom with us today. The work that you're doing guiding families through these really difficult dynamics with compassion, clarity, and the boundaries is so needed and incredibly empowering. To our listeners, be sure to check out their book, Boundary Badass, and explore their courses, boundary scripts. We'll link to everything, all of the resources in the show notes for you. Until next time, remember that parenting is tough, but you don't have to figure it out alone. We're here with you, cheering you on every step of the way.